and welcome back to this little mini-series on writing and my thought processes surrounding said writing. Yes, so characters. This is a subject where I feel I have the most to learn and room to grow, but perhaps maybe that's more just my insecurities surrounding difficulty of understanding people, maybe. But you'll have to see once my books are out and you can read them. So yeah, I just wanted to make this little video series. Again, if you didn't see the last one, go watch that now. Do it. Again, just let's give people a little insight into my thought processes and my just general creative process when it comes to writing and getting ideas and how to process them to the page. And of course, like always, I will always say before all of these videos, I use absolutely zero generative AI in all of my creative processes, because if you do use them to make art, that's not art and you are not a true artist. Fight me. So starting off, where does my ideas for characters come from? And one of the main answers, the first one that really comes to mind, same as with a lot of general ideas for stories, is from dreams. It's not the only source of creativity I have, or idea generation, but it is a significant source of said information and idea creation. So it could be perhaps just a single scene where this character exists in it, within this dream, or perhaps maybe it could be more sort of a fleshed out, a vague outline of an idea of a character in a greater story. Either way, it's difficult to really put it into words, but it's usually just a very small slice of what that character will eventually become. And sometimes, often, the main defining aspect of that character I get from the dream often gets pushed to kind of the sidelines later on. For example, on my second book I'm working on, Never Human, the main character was derived from a dream I had where I was really into Stone Temple Pilots at the time, the band, and their song Creep specifically, because originally the working title for this project was Creep, and one of the most defining lines of that in the chorus is, "I'm half the man I used to be." And in this dream, this character died, but was sort of like only half died. So he was like half alive, half dead, and kind of, it was a weird thing with timelines, so he was kind of half person, really, kind of, that probably doesn't make any sense, but, but that side of it just completely went away as I developed the story, but certain aspects of it remained. I won't reveal too much at the moment. Well, I may hint at, but we'll get into that in a moment. But outside of dreams, characters often come to me through certain functions within a story, and every character needs a role to fulfill within a story, and sometimes it can just be as simple as, I need a character to do this, and that function becomes, much like the dreams, that singular kind of genesis, kind of inception point to develop them from there. Of course, if you made a character purely on that one function, or that one, say, like in slice of the character you may get from the dream or whatever, that's not really a character, and it's from there where they are developed outwardly-ness. No, God! Because, and I said this in the last video, and I'll probably say it in the next video as well, when I go into settings, is these ideas are always stewing away in the mind, and I develop them just thinking them over and over and over before they even get onto the page. So a lot of the development comes from there at the start, which, if I was being graded on this for an exam, I would be, lose all the marks for not showing my working, but that's just how my mind works, okay? There's no rules with writing. Just do it. Sometimes as well, there's also character archetypes, where I feel that it's kind of linked in with sort of like their role in the narrative and the story that I want to tell. But I remember I was reading up about the archetype of the damsel in distress character, and how to sort of subvert that and sort of take it sort of forward into almost its like logical conclusion to truly make a damsel in distress. Sort of how I wanted to tell it was, And this is for another story idea for like way down the line. So spoilers for whichever one that's going to be. But rather than the typical subversion of they're not actually a damsel in distress, they're captured, but they're perfectly capable on their own with their own agency, of course, because, you know, traditionally damsel in distresses don't have much agency, so I wanted to give them that. But then, like, what would it take to take a realistic character with agency to, like, what would it take for them to actually genuinely lose hope? And, you know, of course, I highly doubt I'm the first person who's done that, but in fact I know for a fact I'm not the first person who's done that, but it's an idea I wanted to play out with, and sort of an idea of kind of a character blows out from there. But also at the same time, all these things sort of coalesce together. Like, I've got this idea for a character and this idea, and this could both link up to a character. So I already had an idea for one character beforehand, which probably came from a dream, and this idea of the truly broken damsel in distress type of character, and I could want to tie them together because that would make sense in the kind of story I want to tell. So yeah, as well, another example would be a kind of a play on like the 5-man band, you know, those classic tropes and the different roles people have in that, and subverting that in a way where it's not kind of just like subverting for the sake of subversion, for like a gimmicky sense, but like actually just trying to play with it in a way that how I want to tell it, you know. We'll see how well it turns out in the end when we get to it.
Goldfish.
What the fuck was that? Sorry, I already touched on this earlier, but also it's figuring out these characters' roles within the story. You get your simple, you know, character archetypes of, you know, the protagonist, the antagonist, supporting characters, love interests and that. And of course, like, those are the sort of the points of reference, like the starting points. But again, like I said, in my mind, they always develop beyond that, so that they're not, well, I try to make it a little less one note, of course. I still struggle sometimes. In The Blue Sun, my first one, I've nearly finished, there is a character early on in the story. He's only in like the first act. I won't spoil too much, but he came across very one note, and I've had a few pointers from other people that have helped me develop that character to have a little more depth, because his function in the story is kind of a little one note, but like sort of by design in a way. He's more like an adversary, an obstacle, but still kind of making him feel like an actual person, an actual character. So something that, a motivation that either is sort of a fear of a greater power above, or something, a general belief within themselves that they, you know, that kind of that flaw within them, that, you know, you do get people like that in reality, again without spoiling too much, of course. But the most I will say is kind of a bully type character, but again making it more realistic and fleshed out, even in sort of the limited capacity you sort of can with these sort of characters. And so when it comes to actually getting these characters sort of out there, when it is time to write the story, or at least outline the story, and what I will do is have basically a list of the characters in the story with just very brief outlines and backgrounds. Like I said in the last video, there's a lot of extra context and stuff I know up here that I don't necessarily need to put in the story themselves, or at least in the character breakdown itself, which is why oftentimes they can be a little short and a little vague here and there, but it's just sort of a general reminder who's in the story, what role do they play, and what sort of dynamics involve these characters and their lives and actions intertwining with one another. So it's very simple stuff, just like their name, their age, their occupation, and general characteristics. Oftentimes just something as simple as their general mannerisms and one sort of just general flaw about them, that, you know, one fatal flaw within themselves, to in an attempt to make them feel more fleshed out and more human. But of course, with that alone is not enough, more or less. And sorry, my hair is an absolute mess. I am so sorry. I have these ideas for these characters, they're all laid out, but throughout the outlining and the drafting, and even in between the times, both before and after, I am always running through different simulations in my head, different scenarios in my head, to develop these characters, and not simply just what they would do in these types of situations, but what an actual person, a human being, would do in those situations. Now, of course, when it comes to the actual thought processes, I only really have myself to reference on, at least in sort of the deepest understanding of one's thought processes, but observing the actions of others, especially people who are just have different perspectives to you, fundamentally, that they would just act and react differently, and just to make it make sense. And from there, the simple framework gets, again, more and more built up. And oftentimes it still kind of remains just in here a lot of the time, but that's all I really need in the extra context to be, because at that point or at least I feel like, I hope I have the fundamental understanding of these characters. But of course, characters are always going to be fluid, there's going to be changes here and there and such and whatever. And of course, with external feedback from beta readers, there's always going to be something that may need to change, or there may be like a blind spot in their general characterization, but still from there fleshes them out into as realistic and believable as characters as they can be. So an example would be, oftentimes these are just the moments within the stories, situations that they are going to face and I'm actually going to write about. Other times they can be sort of more external things in their day-to-day life. So for example, what does this character act like to the general public when they do their shopping? What are they like to the cashiers, to the people in every day? Are they just ignore everyone around them, give minimal responses to said cashiers? Or are they more open, talkative, and chatty to everyone? Or perhaps are they have sort of an aloof sense and believe everybody else is kind of beneath them and sort of like look down their noses at everyone around them? And especially it's when you're dealing with more quite difficult situations, taking perhaps some kind of moral dilemmas. For example, something like the trolley problem, for example. What would those characters do in those situations? Not what you would do as the person, as the writer, or what I would do personally. It's what would they do? What would be their thought processes? What would they be conflicted about, or would this be an easy choice for them to make? Perhaps if they have more like a superiority aspect to things, perhaps a little bit more sadistic, then they would likely, of course, have fewer qualms with sacrificing the life of others than, someone more pious or moralistic, essentially. And that's always a fun little thought exercise to do as well. I do a lot of I read a lot of philosophy and do a lot of philosophy like contemplation in my head all the time anyway, so it's really fun to, you're forcing yourself to see things from different perspectives and different angles, which is fun. Well, but for me it is, anyway. And I think as well a major thing that I found that I enjoy with characters, at least when I'm writing them, is to have sort of a duo that, two friends that contrast against one another, juxtaposing. There's that interplay with someone who's perhaps a little bit more reserved and self-doubting versus someone who's a little bit more confident out front and a little bit more generally extroverted, but deep down they are still have their own kind of insecurities, but they sort of hide them a lot more. Whereas that's character B, and then character A, like I said earlier, more outwardly self-doubting, but they take a lot more of a calmer, analytical approach to things and a little bit less, say, bombastic. Sometimes to a little detriment where they can be a little bit, analysis paralysis, or, slow to decide while weighing up all their options, while character B just does it, and when, say, in the moments where quick action is required, they are sort of better and more favoured in that regard. But yes, fun little interplay and all of that stuffs. Yes. And of course, one fundamental bit of advice I could give just beyond all of this is get feedback from other people. Get people to read your story, read what you've written, talk it through with them, because there's always going to be something that somebody else can pick up that you just are completely blind to. Any just beta readers, editors that you can get your hands on, the time and their input, even as subtle as it may be, just worth its weight in gold. Trust me. Well, metaphorical way, because it doesn't actually help it. But anyway, that is that, and got one more video coming out next week, and that will be on setting. So I hope you enjoyed listening to me mindlessly ramble on and on about stuff, and you'll continue to do so in the future. or until I learn how to get my arse in gear and actually write a script for these. But anyway, thank you all for watching. I'll see you next week. Au revoir.
George.